Welcome to this episode of the Catechetical Corner, handing on and defending the faith. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published the Communist Manifesto in 1848. The two men, prior to publication, openly debated on whether or not the title of the work should have been a communist confession of faith. As much as modern socialists who are sympathetic to communist ideology hate to admit it, this political system is an inversion of everything God revealed to humanity in divine revelation. Only the diabolical could create an ape of an actual Catholicism that speaks to every material need of the human person with a complete absence of anything spiritual. Marx once stated the end of religion is the beginning of communism. In this episode, Trent Horn, internationally known apologist from Catholic Answers, makes the case for why Catholics can't be socialist and illustrates in a systematic way how socialism is a stepping stone to communism.
So let's start with a discussion about my first talk, why Catholics can't be socialists. This is based on a book that I wrote called Can a Catholic Be a Socialist? The subtitle is The Answer is No, Here's Why. And I co-authored that with a lovely woman, Catherine McCulloch. She has 8 children. She's a professor of economics, associate professor of economics at the Catholic University of America. And Catherine is just a wonderful individual. She's written on this in peer-reviewed articles. So I knew I wanted to have an economist on my side when I wrote this book. So several years ago, I think his name's Emmanuel Macron. So President Macron of France, he said once, "I don't know an educated woman who has 8 children. I don't know an educated woman who has lots of children." And Catherine took great offense at that because she has her PhD in economics from Harvard and teaches at the Catholic University of America, and she has 8 children. So she inspired other women with PhDs and high-level academic degrees to send postcards of their family to the French president to let him know, oh yes, there are many highly intelligent women. And I would say that a woman can be highly intelligent without having an advanced degree. That's not to say about mothers who are at home who don't have advanced degrees. But especially those with advanced degrees, to tell him, nope, you can be a mother, you can have a place in society, you don't have to sacrifice your family to attain a status in the state. And that's really the problem with modern feminism. Classical feminism just said, look, men and women should be treated equally. If men get to vote, women should be able to vote. If men are recognized as persons under the law, women should be recognized as persons under the law. And that's a good thing. But modern feminism has tried to say that women can only be equal to men if they are the same as men. I'll talk about this more in my third talk on LGBTQ issues. But there's just this idea that, women have to be able to be like men. Since men can have sexual relations and not get pregnant, women have to do that to succeed. So they need contraception, they need abortion. And that's not the case. We can have equality between men and women while still recognizing that men and women are different. So these are the kinds of things that we're seeing with modern socialism. And this is something that is made a resurgence recently. It comes up in all different kinds of areas. You see the so-called Green New Deal, for example, promising all kinds of jobs and benefits for people under the auspices of reducing climate change. And yet a summary of this document that was quickly yanked from a congressional website a year ago said that the Green New Deal would promise income for people who either can't work or do not want to work. So, of course, we should provide for people who are unable to work, people who are disabled, people who are infirm. We should provide for people who are incapable of providing for themselves. But the idea that even if someone says they don't want to work, and some people thought, oh, that's not really what it meant. I read an article later at vox.com, vox.com, kind of a left-leaning news website, defending this, saying that, well, maybe some people do need to be paid. They don't want to work. What about the aspiring author who wants to write the next great American novel? Maybe we should pay him to do that. No, you're just going to waste a lot of money and you're going to get a book that nobody wants to read. So in order to understand this, I think we have to go back to the roots of understanding what socialism is and why the church has uniformly opposed socialism for the past 150 years. That ever since socialism came on the scene at the beginning and the middle of the 19th century. The Catholic Church has always opposed it. Now, when we talk about socialism, though, we have to get our definitions right, because invariably, whenever I bring this up, people will say, well, what's wrong with socialism? Don't you like public parks? Don't you like social security? Don't you like government programs to help people, like food stamps, for example? What's wrong with that? And I tell them that is not socialism, that is social welfare. So when government spends its revenue on goods that are available to the public, that is social welfare. And now there are times when that may not be prudent. In fact, in Centesimus Annus, Pope St. John Paul II said that if the state should caution against becoming a so-called welfare state, that was the words that he used, that if the state becomes a welfare state where everyone's livelihood depends on entitlements from the state, then it becomes bloated, bureaucratic, inefficient, and seeks to ultimately replace the family as the central unit of society. So that's not socialism, it's social welfare. Socialism, so people will say public libraries, is that socialism? We'll say no, if the government wants to buy books and create a system where you can go and check out books, that's not socialism. Socialism would be if the government owned all the books and decided these are the books you get and these are the books you get. And if you try to buy a book outside of this government library, you're going to go to jail because it's illegal to sell books on the private market. You can only go to the government library. That would be socialism. So socialism, the classical definition of socialism, if you look up any encyclopedia of economics, it says that socialism is when the means of production, those things that produce goods and services and wealth, so land, factories, intellectual property, companies, uh, when those things are owned by the state, or sorry, by the community, society, they're owned socially rather than privately. So the question is not whether government provides benefits. Every single modern country on earth does that. The question is who owns the means of production? Who owns these businesses? Who owns and retains the wealth that they generate? Is it private individuals and shareholders in companies? Or is it the community as a whole? Now, in practice, though, the communists and socialists, the more ideological, the people who have the ideologies, who are starry-eyed activists, will say, "Oh, well, the community will own it all." But in practice, throughout history, it's never the community. So we live in a republic, so we elect representatives to make these decisions for us. And odds are, if we lived in a socialist or communist country, we wouldn't make all these decisions about the means of production ourselves. We would elect other people. We would elect bureaucrats, and the bureaucrats would decide these things and allocate resources to people, which is exactly what happened in the Soviet Union, in China, and in other failed socialist and communist states, which I discuss at length in my book. So that's important to understand what socialism is. Socialism is not what government gives people per se. It's about what government lets them keep. Will you keep the fruits of your labor? Will you keep your income? Do you get to keep the company that you've created? Or do you have to surrender all the profits your company makes to the state for the state to redistribute it to other people? So why can't Catholics be socialists? Let me take you on a brief historical tour to understand socialism, economics, Christianity, and I think it'll put the whole picture into place. So let's go all the way back to the time of Jesus Christ. Remember when Jesus famously said that it is easier for a rich man to pass through, it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter into heaven. And what Jesus meant by that is that it's almost impossible for rich people to get into heaven, at least during his time, because the word rich, of course, is going to be relative. Uh, Almost every single person in America today, if you ask someone in the time of Christ to look at people in America today, they would say that we were rich. So if you go back though, so that's why it's important when Jesus says that rich people probably won't get into heaven. We don't want to stretch that too far because from their perspective, their time, almost everybody who lives now would be under that. And second, Jesus's words were reflected to a very specific class of people. Now, there were rich people even in the time of Christ and before who were honorable, who were honored by God. Job was a wealthy person. Abraham was wealthy. Um, Joseph of Arimathea was a wealthy member of the Sanhedrin who was a disciple of Jesus. He was wealthy enough to afford a brand new tomb for Jesus to be laid in. But the fact of the matter is, most rich people in the time of Christ, they were crooks. There is an old Mediterranean proverb that said, every rich person is the thief or the son of a thief. Because the only way, so wealth during the time of Christ was basically land, minerals, it was minted coins, land, animals. That was wealth. And what most rich people did was that they hoarded their wealth, and if they had a lot of material goods, that meant that other people had to go without. That's why Jesus upbraided in the parable. He talks about the guy. You remember the guy who built the two barns? He said, "I have so much wheat. I need to build a second barn to store it all." And he never thinks of sharing it with his kin or with other people who are down and out. And so Jesus condemns the man, saying, "You had all this wealth, and your life will be demanded of you tonight. And what will your wealth? What will it do for you?" That's why Jesus said, "Store up your wealth in heaven, where robbers can't steal it, where it won't rust, where it won't collapse in a stock market." So that's an understanding of wealth at that time, that basically you had the small minority of rich people and everybody else was poor. Some were destitute, but the rest lived in relative poverty. Let's go then forward to the early apostolic Christians, because people will say, but weren't the first Christians communists? Weren't they socialists? They held everything in common, as Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 4 says. And that's right, that after Peter gave his sermon at Pentecost, after he gave that very famous sermon, 3,000 people converted and they stayed in Jerusalem. They were there for a Jewish festival and they stayed with the church. But guess what? 3,000 people, what are you going to do with everybody? You can't just put them up in an Airbnb. So they voluntarily shared their goods with other people. But the first Christians did not teach that the government had an obligation to do this, or even that all Christians had an obligation to do this. This was charity, not communism. Because when you read the letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians, the part where he says God loves a cheerful giver, you remember that part? Paul is appealing to the Corinthians to donate to support famine relief for the church in Judea. And he says, I'm not going to mandate you, and I don't have to do that because I know that you're generous. But if the early church were communists who believed that all wealth should be centralized and reallocated, or socialists, and people will say, well, Trent, communism and socialism is not the same thing. You're right. Socialism is the first step. Vladimir Lenin said that first you have the state mandating equality, and then eventually you don't need the state anymore and you get communism. So you start with socialism, then you end up at pure communism. But nobody ever ends up at communism because the bureaucrats in charge of the state always end up sticking around and getting a sweet deal out of socialism. So Paul made it clear that there was no mandatory tithing in the early church, and the funds that people had were not centrally allocated, and property wasn't centrally allocated and then redistributed. So the first Christians didn't practice communism, and as the Roman Empire fell and Christians attained wealth and status in the Roman Empire, we see in the church fathers a prescription for them to understand that, yes, you can have wealth, but you have a severe moral obligation to use your wealth to benefit the poor, because there's no one else to benefit the poor. Julian the Apostate, who was a Roman emperor in I want to say the 5th century, 4th or 5th century, I think it was late 4th century. He said that everyone goes to the Christians for help. They don't even come to us for assistance in famines. That Julian the Apostate griped that it was the Christians who supported people who were in need in the Roman Empire when the government failed to do that. So the church fathers, people like St. John Chrysostom, said, if you're a rich man, I don't forbid that, but if you're rapacious, if you're greedy, if you acquire wealth to the detriment of others, that's where you've committed a sin. And so as we go from the 4th or 5th century after Christ going up into the Middle Ages, we don't have a lot that changes economically. We have a move away from slavery to serfdom. So serfs who lived on feudal estates, they had more rights than slaves had in ancient Rome, but they were still, so you didn't own a serf like you owned a slave, but the serf was tied to the land. He had a little plot of land on the lord's estate, his manor, and oftentimes he could keep the extra things that he grew or made and would sell them at medieval fairs. Nobody got rich that way, though. So still, wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few. And land was the primary means of acquiring wealth at that time. In the 17th and the 18th centuries, you have factories springing up in Manchester, England, and London, and other centers, and people flocked from the farms, from the rural areas, to live in the cities. Now, this did have a drawback, though. You had the influx of people going into the cities, and they became crowded, disease-ridden, and there were employers who took advantage of their employees. They viewed their employees as basically being extensions of the machines that they owned. And so there were workers that were being exploited. There was child labor. There were unsuitable working conditions for people. And yet many workers still flock to the cities, even in spite of these conditions, because as many people have nostalgic thoughts about farm life, but agricultural work, especially in the 17th and 18th century, was backbreaking, awful, and you were always just one blight or one bad crop away from famine and starvation. So it's not the bucolic existence that a lot of people have when they think about it. So you'll flood in these cities, but it wasn't the greatest conditions. So you had individuals who argued that the employers in these factories were making all this money. You had people becoming wealthy, but the workers were not sharing in the wealth in the same way. And so they argued that the factories and the other companies that should be owned by the workers, that the regular people should own all this wealth, not these few individuals. And so it should be owned socially. And that began the rise of socialism in the 18th and then especially in the 19th century through the likes of individuals like Karl Marx or Friedrich Engels, who were arguing for this. And it eventually led to revolution. In 1870, a group of socialists took over the city of Paris for 2 weeks, arguing for demands that they had to turn it into a socialist commune. Then we go to 1893, or sorry, in the 1890s. The church finally weighs in. Now, the church had actually waited on socialism all the way back to Pope Pius IX at the middle of the 19th century, talking about the envy and poison of socialism. But Pope Leo the 13th provided the most comprehensive reply to socialism in his encyclical Rerum Novarum. And so he said, look, on the one hand, factory owners, you have a moral obligation to not treat your employees like bags of coal, to not subject women and children to unsuitable working conditions, to not, he said, don't grind people into dust. So he spoke to them, but he said that the socialists were the other end of the extreme, saying they stir up strife and envy. And he said that the main tenet of socialism, the community of goods, must be rejected. This idea of things being owned in common has to be rejected, he said, because it violates the natural right to private property, to provide for oneself. And so Pope Leo the 13th said that if people are free to work and save and live a life of thrift, then they can achieve security and comfort for themselves. And that is what he recommended for people to achieve, and then to be able to pass that wealth on via an inheritance to one's children, which was something that was anathema to socialists. And Leo warned that if socialism took hold, it would reap a harvest of misery. In fact, that is what Catherine and I wanted to originally call our book Harvest of Misery, because that's what he said socialism was. And then history would bear that out, and that the principles Pope Leo the 13th enunciated would be seen continuing in the historical record. So, so socialism, it just doesn't work. And then we see this in the 20th century. There's always a repeat of what happens. A nation attempts to use socialism. It spectacularly fails. Western sympathizers who love socialism cover it up. And then later, when it's exposed, they say that wasn't true socialism. Three case studies. One, the Soviet Union. Soviet Union enacted the socialist principles of Karl Marx, and they've said, oh, well, we're going to be able to provide for everyone. And so they collectivized farming. And what happened is they ended up starving the Ukrainian farmers in something called the Holodomor, murder by starvation in Ukrainians. 6 million people died. And also the Soviet Union had bread lines, food shortages, because when these factories were told, you're not worrying about profit, you just have to produce, they had no incentive to be efficient because the government funded them and they would never go out of business. So they always produced machines that didn't work. They always had shortages of food that was required if they didn't steal it from people in order to produce more machinery. And so what happened during this Great Famine, Walter Duranty of the New York Times covered it up. He still has his Pulitzer Prize, by the way, which should have been revoked. And then later, though, of course, when it couldn't be hidden anymore, people said, well, the Soviet Union's not real socialism. Okay, what about China? China promised all its workers after the communists took over in the 1950s. They said, look, iron rice bowl. Everybody gets 3 bowls of rice a day. You'll never go hungry again. And they told people, guess what? Under the Communist Party, you can't lose your job. Everyone has job security. And they thought if you couldn't lose, if you weren't worried about losing your job, you wouldn't be nervous and stressed and you would work harder. Let me ask you this. If you knew you couldn't be fired, would you work harder or maybe take it easier at the office? Probably easier. And then it happened again. Food production plummeted. And then China suffered the worst famine in the history of the world. 30 million people died. Half of them were under the age of 10. People propped up their loved ones in bed, the corpses of their loved ones, to trick government officials into still providing the rations for these people. It was grotesque. And there was wheat in silos. People were begging the communist leaders to give them, and they said, we will not give it to them. These are the cries of socialism, the cries of revolution. And then it was covered up in the press. And then later on, people said, well, China's not real socialism. And they said, well, it's not socialism, it's mismanagement. Look, socialism by definition is mismanagement. It is when government tries to allocate for everyone, tries to plan for every family, plan for every economic exchange, and it simply doesn't work because no one can have the knowledge of all of these affairs to properly set prices for things. Otherwise, when prices are set arbitrarily, you end up with a surplus of things you don't need or a shortage of things that you do need. Now, some people will say, yes, but what about the Nordic countries like Sweden, for example? They're socialist, or Denmark. They're not, though. In 2015, the prime minister of Denmark said, we're not a socialist country. Sweden has more billionaires per capita than the United States. I mean, all that IKEA money's got to go somewhere, right? Rather, they are capitalist countries that have a wealthy entitlement program. And that is something Catholics can reasonably disagree about whether you want the Nordic economic model, which has trade-offs. It has trade-offs for slower economic growth, the need to restrict immigration, for example. So there are trade-offs in all kinds of economic models Catholics can reasonably disagree about. However, the church has affirmed, because of its detriment to the human community, because it violates the natural rights to private property, because it tries to replace the family and make the family dependent on the state instead of the other way around. That is why Pope Pius XI in Quadragesimo Anno, section 120, says that no good Catholic can be a true socialist. Pope Pius, is interesting, he used true socialist because there's always people, even in his time, who said, oh, well, I'm a socialist. And it's no, you just believe in generous government entitlement programs. You're not a true socialist. And that is the same today. There are people who will argue for things and call it socialism, but it's not. Things that Catholics can reasonably disagree about. But true socialism, the idea of the community or the state owning the means of production, the state nationalizing industries so that everybody ends up working for the government and having income redistributed accordingly, that is something that Catholics cannot support and has been consistently condemned up to the present pontificate, I would say. So socialism is interesting that it takes as the idea that, well, yeah, there's the command, thou shalt not steal. And it's interesting when people say, why is socialism wrong? I tell them, because thou shalt not steal. You're taking what is the rightful fruit of another person, of his work, and you want it for yourself. And well, this is funny, actually. I remember I've asked people online, look, do you think that there should be billionaires? And they'll say, oh, I don't want billionaires. I'm like, well, I don't see what the problem is per se with someone being a billionaire if they use their wealth wisely. Most of the people who are billionaires, it's not because they have a bunch of money in a bank, and it's not like they have a bunch of dollar bills in a vault like Scrooge McDuck, gold coins in a big vault. It's because they own the majority share in a company that is extremely profitable, and they own the majority share, so they control the company, and through that stock, they're very wealthy because of that. But if they sold all the stock, they'd have money, but they wouldn't have a way of generating any more wealth. And I've asked them, well, would it be okay to be a billionaire if there were no poverty? This is where it's interesting. I said, would it be wrong to be a billionaire if everyone else at least had comfortable basic living? They were not poor. They had all the basic necessities of life and they lived with a standard of decency. It might be sparse, but it's not poverty. It's just not wealth. And I said, would it still be wrong to be a billionaire? And these people say, yes, it would still be wrong. They should not have that much more than everyone else. And I thought that was just fascinating. That for them, it wasn't about poverty. Even if poverty were eradicated, they still would hate. They hate the idea that somebody makes so much more than they do, and so they think that it would be wrong to steal from. No, someone couldn't steal from them, but if they stole from someone who's really wealthy, that's okay because they consider it unfair for that person to have more than them. And just to tie a bow on what I said about socialism before I get into relativism, it's not unfair. It's funny, people will see this about certain kinds of people who are billionaires or millionaires, but they don't say that about other kinds of people like athletes or actors. People don't get mad when actors or athletes make tens of millions of dollars and make far much more than other people. I think it's because they think there's a direct benefit there that they enjoy watching them on television. But it makes sense because it's based on what Pope Leo XIII said in his encyclical Rerum Novarum, was that human beings are equal in dignity, but we are unequal in talents, abilities, and fortunes. And that leads to natural inequalities among us.
Pope Pius XI issued his encyclical Quadragesimo Anno in 1931 and stated in a very blunt way that religious socialism or Christian socialism are contradictory terms. No one can be at the same time a good Catholic and a true socialist. Well-intentioned and not well-formed Catholics have been at times hoodwinked into social justice causes that are only aimed at providing a material need in the complete absence of a spiritual one. Any movement cloaked in a Catholic social doctrine must be vetted and provide evidence that its primary end is the salvation of a soul, not just the alleviation of an earthly difficulty. Earthly utopia as a fallen world is impossible. Grace builds and perfects human nature, and fallen human nature apart from grace is ordered toward death, not eternal life. It's our job to take advantage of any spiritual work of mercy in order to provide the much greater need of a spiritual one. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Catechetical Corner, and join us next time as Trent Horn, Catholic Answers apologist, unwraps Catholic responses to moral relativism, a direct byproduct of socialistic principles entrenched in the secular world. God love you, and we'll see you next time.